So when you are selecting your sample for who's going to be interviewed for your study, then you will be using generally a purposive sample or a convenience sample, which means that you're using either specifically going to certain people because of certain characteristics, or trying to jump on a sample that is easy to capture, maybe a group that's already meeting. Again, you don't see generally that intensive interviewing is going to be done with a random sample because of the intensity that goes with the work. So you're obviously picking people because they know something about what you want to learn. They're willing to talk to you, which is huge. And they represent a range of perspectives. So you're trying to capture people that have different opinions. Up until you get to saturation point. So there's a point at which you're not hearing anything new. You're hearing the same general thoughts and opinions and attitudes and feelings, and that's the point at which you're supposed to stop. So you keep going until what's called a saturation point. Now, when you're doing intensive interviewing, this is very similar to what you recall from your basic practice classes about how to engage a client. It's really no different than the way you would interact with somebody in a research role. You're explaining the purpose, so you're being very straightforward. You're showing them interest. You're building rapport. You want to make sure that you're courteous and ethical and respectful. And you also don't want to go too fast to have a sense of urgency. You want to follow the pace of interviewers. Oftentimes it's good to do a pilot interview just to kind of make sure your questions flow and you feel comfortable and at ease. But again, general practice guidelines are the same thing you would use here. Don't be this guy. Don't be the guy that is basically trying to ask questions, plug in the answer, spends more time talking than you do. You know those people, you know those social workers. So be very, very careful about not bringing too many of your own biases and perceptions into the interview. So what process do you follow? Well, first you have to have questions. You have to have an outline. You can be flexible. Maybe there's, again, maybe the interviewee brings up something before you're ready or before the order, and you go with it. You try to let it be natural and organic. So again, you have to be very comfortable. You want to know what your questions are, which means generally you're not doing a lot. 10 questions is generally the max, because again, you need to know on the top of your head, oh, this person just brought up this question I wanted to ask about. You don't want to have to keep referring to your notes. You also want to make those questions short and to the point. You don't want them to have what do you think, and if you think yes, what do you think about this, and elaborate on this. Now, that means you usually might just ask a question like, tell me about your relationship with your children. Your personal notes might tell you that if somebody happens to mention conflict, you want to ask about what that looks like, or how often does that happen, or who tends to be around for it. So those are called probes, and that's just like you would use in a clinical social work setting. Those are used to elicit more information, and you can ask those follow-up questions around their answers. Generally, you will use a tape recorder, and it's not meant to be a substitute for note-taking, but generally it's meant to be a backup. Generally, you, if you're able to, you may have a note taker. You may just have to find a good note-taking method of recording just specific thoughts and ideas, and then later go back to your recording equipment to really pull down a lot of the information that you may not have captured in your notes. So that then takes us into focus groups. Focus groups are slightly different than interviews in that you are basically doing interviews with multiple people at the same time, but the difference here is that it's not meant to be convenient. You're in focus groups, you're not doing it just because you want to save yourself the time of interviewing 5 people at once. You're doing it because that group dynamic, the way they play off of each other, the way they talk with each other, and one person may say something that somebody else remembers. You're doing it because that group dynamic is important. That group dynamic does not exist and is not important in intensive interviewing. In focus groups, you'll still have specific questions, you'll guide the discussion, but now you have an added element of facilitation because now you want to make sure that, just again, as in your practice class for how to facilitate a group, now you're making sure that everybody has a chance to talk, that nobody dominates the conversation, so you're still following certain guidelines here. It is also extremely important to remember that just like in intensive interviewing, in focus groups, you do not have representative samples, nor are you intending to. So again, it is not a limitation of a research study when you see that the sample is not representative because that is not the intention. That is not a goal for focus groups. You're not generalizing beyond the focus group. So keep in mind then you recruit people based on, again, certain criteria because they have time, because they have knowledge, because in some way they match with your target population. And so your facilitation of this group will generally focus on trying to keep the conversation as natural and organic as possible. You'll also see a couple of examples here of research that includes focus groups in the way that they have explored questions about either health or politics in these specific examples.